Commander Lyria stood on the bridge of her scout vessel and watched the stars streak past in brilliant lines of light as her ship traveled faster than any natural thing should move, and beside her chair, two dragons lay curled together breathing, in perfect rhythm with each other. Ash was the smaller of the pair with emerald scales that caught the light from the control panels and made him glow like a living jewel in the darkness of space. And his brother Ember was larger with ruby-red scales that seemed to hold fire beneath their surface, and both creatures had been her companions since they hatched from their eggs 20 years ago. The bond between an elf and their dragons was sacred and went deeper than words or thoughts, and Lyria could feel their emotions as clearly as her own, and right now both dragons were restless and uneasy, as if they sensed something terrible approaching. Kira, her communications officer, looked up from her station with worry in her golden eyes and reported that they were approaching the coordinates where the Council fleet had last transmitted, and Lyria felt her stomach tighten with fear because 200 warships did not simply disappear without explanation. The Galactic Council had ruled. Known space for 12,000 cycles, and their military might was unmatched by any single species, and their fleets had conquered worlds and crushed rebellions and enforced laws across 1,000 star systems, and nothing had ever stood against them and survived. 3 months ago, the Council had sent their largest battle group to the outer territories where the humans lived in forced isolation behind a barrier of restricted space, and the humans had been quarantined for 300 years. After they had been deemed too aggressive and too unpredictable to join galactic society, the Council feared what humans might do if given access to advanced technology and access to other worlds, and so humanity had been locked away on their birth planet and in their home system, with automated defense stations preventing any ship from entering or leaving. But something had changed recently, and human ships had been detected beyond the quarantine zone, and the Council had responded with overwhelming force, demanding immediate surrender and compliance with galactic law. And then silence, and 200 warships had gone dark in less than an hour. Lyria had been chosen to investigate because elven scouts were the best in the galaxy, and because her ship was small and fast and non-threatening, and the Council hoped that whatever destroyed their fleet might allow her to approach and gather information. Her crew consisted of only 12 elves, all of them experienced scouts who had served together for years, and they trusted each other completely, and trusted Lyria to lead them through whatever dangers waited ahead. The ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel with a shudder that made the dragons lift their heads and look around. With alert eyes, and Lyria gripped the arms of her command chair as the view screen flickered to life, showing normal space ahead. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat, and the bridge fell silent as every crew member stared at the horror floating before them. Debris filled the void as far as sensors could detect, and twisted metal and shattered hulls, and the remnants of what had once been the pride of the galactic fleet, and pieces of warships tumbled slowly through space, some larger than her entire vessel, and others reduced to fragments no bigger than her hand. Kira worked her controls with shaking fingers and reported that she was detecting 217 distinct debris fields, matching the energy signatures of the missing Council ships, and there were no survivors and no escape pods and no distress beacons. Still transmitting, Lyria ordered a full sensor sweep of the area, and her science officer Mira began analyzing the wreckage, trying to determine what kind of weapons could cause such destruction, and the young elf worked in silence for several minutes before looking up with confusion on her face. The damage patterns made no sense, Mira explained, and the ships had not been hit by energy weapons or kinetic projectiles or anything that left recognizable signatures, and instead it looked like the hulls had been torn apart from the inside, as if something had materialized within the ships and ripped them to pieces. Ash crawled into Lyria's lap and pressed his snout against her chest, seeking comfort, and she stroked his scales absently while trying to process what she was hearing, and Ember remained on the floor, but his eyes were fixed on the view screen, and a low rumble came from his throat. How was such a thing possible, Lyria asked, and every species in the galaxy used some variation of the same basic technologies, and energy shields protected ships from external attacks, and hull armor was designed to withstand incredible force. And yet these warships had been destroyed as easily as if they were made of paper. Mira had no answer, and could only shake her head and suggest that perhaps the humans had discovered something new, and something that the Council had never encountered before, and the thought sent chills down Lyria's spine. The humans had been isolated for 3 centuries, with limited resources and limited technology, and they should have stagnated behind their barrier, or perhaps advanced slowly in predictable ways, and instead, they had somehow developed weapons that could destroy the galaxy's most powerful fleet. A proximity alarm suddenly shrieked across the bridge, and Ember launched himself into the air with a roar that shook the small vessel, and Ash leaped from Lyria's lap and joined his brother, circling the command deck with their wings spread wide. 3 massive contacts appeared on sensors, and Lyria's heart hammered in her chest as she watched 3 enormous ships materialize out of nowhere. And they had not been detected approaching and had not triggered any alarms until they were already there. The human warships were like nothing Lyria had ever seen, and they were huge, each one at least 5 times the size of a council battleship, and their hulls were black. Not painted black, but black like the void itself, as if they had been cut from empty space and shaped into vessels. Lyria stared at the view screen, unable to look away from the impossible ships that floated before her, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was looking at the weapons that had destroyed the council fleet, and that her small scout vessel would not survive if the humans decided to attack. Kira's voice broke the silence, asking what they should do and whether they should run or fight or try to communicate. And Lyria took a deep breath and made the only choice that made sense. She ordered Kira to open a communication channel and broadcast on all frequencies that they came in peace and meant no harm, and that they were only investigating what happened to the missing fleet. The seconds stretched into eternity as they waited for a response, and the dragons settled back onto the deck but remained tense and ready to fight if needed. And Lyria kept her eyes fixed on the black warships that hung in space like predators deciding whether to strike. Then the view screen flickered, and a human face appeared, and everything changed. The woman who appeared on the view screen was young, perhaps 30 years old by human standards, and she had brown hair pulled back in a simple tail, and wore a gray uniform with no decorations or medals, and her nameplate identified her as Captain Linda Hayes of the vessel. Nightfall Lyria had expected many things from humanity after seeing what their weapons could do, and she had expected arrogance or hostility, or perhaps cold military precision. And instead, the human woman smiled warmly, as if greeting an old friend rather than a potential enemy. Captain Hayes spoke in perfect galactic common with only a slight accent that made some words sound softer than they should, and she asked if Lyria was there to attack or to talk, and her tone suggested she already knew the answer, but wanted to hear it spoken aloud. Lyria found her voice after a moment of surprise and explained that she commanded a scout vessel sent to investigate the disappearance of the council fleet, and that she had no weapons capable of threatening the human ships and no desire to start a fight. She could not win. The human captain nodded as if this was exactly what she expected to hear, and she leaned back in her chair looking relaxed despite the debris field floating all around them, and she asked if Lyria had seen enough to understand what happened to the council's warships. Lyria glanced at Ash and Ember, who watched the view screen with intense focus, and she felt through their bond that the dragons were studying the human, carefully trying to determine if she was friend or foe, and they had not yet decided. She told Captain Hayes that her science officer had analyzed the wreckage and found damage patterns that made no sense, and that the ships appeared to have been destroyed from within rather than by external weapons, and she asked directly, what kind of technology could cause such destruction? Linda Hayes smiled again, but this time there was no warmth in it, and she said that the Council had made a terrible mistake when they sent warships to human space and demanded surrender, as if humanity were criminals who needed to be punished for existing. The human captain explained that 300 years ago, the Galactic Council had decided humans were too dangerous to be allowed into the wider galaxy, and they had built a barrier around Earth and the solar system, and declared that any human ship that tried to leave would be destroyed without warning. For 3 centuries, humanity had been trapped and unable to explore the stars and unable to trade with other species and unable to grow beyond their single system, and the Council had justified this by claiming humans were too violent and too unpredictable and needed time to mature as a civilization. But humans did not accept their prison quietly. Linda continued, and they had spent those 300 years working and studying and pushing the boundaries of science in ways the Council never imagined possible, and they had been forced to innovate because they had no other choice. When you lock a species away and give them nothing but time and desperation, the humans said you should not be surprised when they find solutions to problems that others thought impossible. Kira spoke up from her station asking what the humans had discovered, and what weapon could penetrate shields and armor, and destroy ships from the inside. And her voice carried the fear that every crew member felt. Captain Hayes gestured to someone off screen, and suddenly the view screen split, showing complex diagrams and equations that made Lyria's head hurt just looking at them. And the human began to explain in simpler terms. Dark matter, the captain said. And humanity had learned to manipulate and control dark matter in ways that no other species had achieved, and dark matter made up most of the universe, but it passed through normal matter without interacting most of the time, and that was why it was so hard to detect or use. But humans had figured out how to make dark matter interact on command, Linda explained, and they could cause it to solidify inside enemy ships, or to disrupt the molecular bonds that held hulls together. And the weapons left no energy signature, and no warning, and no defense. Mira gasped and said that was impossible, because every species in the galaxy had tried to harness dark matter for thousands of years, and all had failed because the energy requirements were beyond what any reactor could produce. The human captain shrugged and said humans did not think about impossible, the same way other species did, and when you were locked in a cage with limited resources, you either found new answers or you died. And humanity had chosen to find answers. Lyria felt the weight of this revelation settling over her like a heavy blanket, and she understood now why the Council fleet had been destroyed so completely, and why there had been no warning and no chance to retreat. And the humans had struck with weapons that could not be blocked or avoided. She asked the question that everyone on her crew wanted answered, and she asked what humanity planned to do now, and whether they intended to take revenge on the Council worlds for 300 years of imprisonment. Linda Hayes stood from her chair and walked closer to the camera, and her expression grew serious and intense, and she spoke in a voice that carried absolute conviction. Humanity wanted only one thing, she said, and that was freedom, and the freedom to explore the galaxy, and to trade with other species, and to exist without being treated like dangerous animals that needed to be caged. But the captain added, and her voice became harder. The Council needed to understand that humanity would never accept imprisonment again, and any fleet sent to enforce the old quarantine would meet the same fate as this one. And that was not a threat, but simply a statement of fact. The Council could choose peace, and could recognize human sovereignty, and could allow humanity to join the galactic community as equals, or they could choose war and find out just how creative humans could be when their survival was threatened. Ember growled softly, and Lyria felt through their bond what the dragon sensed, and Linda Hayes was a predator and a hunter, and someone who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation if necessary. And humanity had been pushed into a corner, and had emerged with claws and teeth sharp enough to tear apart. The Galaxy Lyria made a decision in that moment that would change everything, and she told Captain Hayes that she would return to Council space and deliver humanity's message personally, and she would advocate for peace and for recognition of human sovereignty. The human studied her for a long moment and then nodded and said she appreciated Lyria's courage, and that humanity remembered its friends as well as its enemies, and perhaps one day elves and humans could explore the stars together as equals. The transmission ended, and the 3 massive black warships vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, and Lyria stood on her bridge knowing that nothing would ever be the same. The journey back to Council space took 6 days, and Lyria spent most of that time in her quarters trying to organize her thoughts, while Ash and Ember lay beside her providing silent comfort through their bond. She knew that the message she carried would shake the foundations of galactic civilization, and the Council had never been challenged so directly, and had never faced an enemy that could destroy their fleets with such ease. Kira had compiled all the sensor data from their encounter, and Mira had written detailed reports about the dark matter weapons and their theoretical capabilities, and the crew had worked together to create a comprehensive brief that left no doubt about humanity's power. But Lyria worried that the Council would not listen, or worse, that they would respond with anger rather than wisdom, and send even more ships to punish humanity for daring to break free from their cage. On the third day of travel, Lyria called her senior officers to her ready room, and they gathered around the small table with worried expressions, and she asked them to speak honestly about what they thought would happen when they delivered their report. Kira spoke first and said that the council would probably refuse to believe that humans had developed such advanced weapons and would dismiss the report as exaggeration or sensor malfunction. Mira disagreed and said the debris field evidence was too extensive to ignore, and the council would have to acknowledge that something destroyed their fleet, but they might blame it on unknown aliens or spatial anomalies rather than accept that humans were responsible. The tactical officer, a quiet elf named Tara, suggested that the council might see this as an opportunity, and if humans had truly mastered dark matter manipulation, then controlling the technology would be worth any price, and the council might try to steal or reverse engineer the weapons. Lyria listened to each perspective and felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her, and she was just a scout commander and not a diplomat or politician. And yet the fate of billions might rest on how well she presented her case. Ash climbed onto the table and looked at each officer in turn, and then pressed his snout against Lyria's hand, and through their bond, she felt his absolute confidence in her, and Ember rumbled agreement from his place by the door. She told her officers that they would present the facts clearly and completely, and would recommend that the council pursue peace rather than war, and what happened after that would be beyond their control. On the sixth day, they arrived at the council homeworld and requested immediate landing clearance, and within hours Lyria found herself standing before the full council assembly in the great hall where decisions that shaped the galaxy were made. The council consisted of representatives from 47 species, each one chosen for their wisdom and experience, and they sat in a semicircle of elevated seats looking down at Lyria like judges preparing to pass sentence. The head counselor was an ancient being named Theron, who belonged to one of the first species to achieve space travel, and he had served on the council for over 200 years, and his word carried more weight than any other. Theron called the session to order and asked Lyria to present her report, and she stepped forward with Ash and Ember flanking her and began to speak. She described finding the debris field and the complete destruction of 200 warships, and she showed sensor readings and analysis reports and images of the twisted metal floating in space. She explained the damage patterns and how the ships had been destroyed from within, and how no known weapon could replicate such effects. Then she told them about the human warships and their impossible black hulls, and the encounter with Captain Linda Hayes and the explanation of dark matter weapons. The council chamber erupted into chaos, as representatives shouted questions and accusations, and some demanded proof, while others called for immediate military action against humanity. Theron raised his hand for silence, and the hall gradually quieted, though tension still filled the air. Like electricity before a storm, he asked Lyria directly if she believed the humans were telling the truth about their capabilities, and whether they truly posed a threat to galactic security. Lyria took a deep breath, and through her bond with the dragons, she drew strength and courage, and she told the council that humanity had proven their capability beyond any doubt, and that sending another fleet would only result in more deaths. She said that humans wanted peace and recognition, not war, and that they had only defended themselves when the council sent warships to enforce an unjust quarantine. Several council members objected loudly, saying the quarantine had been necessary to protect the galaxy from human aggression and violence. But Lyria stood her ground and asked how long a species should be punished for crimes they might commit in the future, and whether 300 years of isolation was justice or simply fear disguised as wisdom. A counselor from the Dravian Collective demanded to know why they should negotiate with species who destroyed council ships, and whether that did not prove humans were exactly as dangerous as predicted. Lyria felt Ember's anger through their bond, but kept her voice calm as she explained that the council sent warships first and demanded surrender without offering dialogue, and that humanity had responded to aggression with force just as any species would when threatened. Theron studied her in silence for a long moment and then asked what Lyria recommended the council do. She said they should send a diplomatic mission instead of warships, and should offer to discuss terms for ending the quarantine, and allowing humanity to join the galactic community. She said, they should do this, not out of weakness but out of wisdom, because humans had proven they could not be contained by force, and continuing the quarantine would only guarantee war. The council chamber fell silent as representatives considered her words, and Lyria could see doubt and fear and anger on many faces. Finally, Theron spoke and said the council would deliberate and would announce their decision within 3 days, and Lyria was dismissed, but ordered to remain available for further questioning. She left the Great Hall with Ash and Ember and returned to her ship, where her crew waited anxiously for news. Kira asked how it went, and Lyria could only shake her head because she honestly did not know if she had made any difference. That night, Lyria lay in her quarters, unable to sleep, while the dragons curled around her and she stared at the ceiling, wondering if the council would choose peace or if they would let pride and fear lead them to destruction. Through the bond, she felt Ash's concern and Ember's protective instincts, and she sent them feelings of gratitude for their constant presence. On the 3rd day, Lyria was summoned back to the council chamber, and she walked through the halls with her dragons and prepared herself for whatever decision had been reached. Theron announced that the council had voted and the decision had not been unanimous, but a majority had agreed on a course of action. The quarantine would be suspended temporarily, and a diplomatic mission would be sent to negotiate with humanity, and Lyria would lead that mission because she had established contact and had proven herself capable of working with humans. Relief flooded through Lyria, but it was mixed with new worry, because now she would be responsible for maintaining peace between two powers who did not trust each other. 2 weeks later, Lyria's ship approached the edge of human space with an official diplomatic convoy of 5 vessels flying council peace banners and carrying representatives from 12 species who had volunteered or been ordered to participate in the mission. The journey had been tense and uncomfortable because many of the diplomats did not trust humans, and several had argued loudly that the council was making a mistake by negotiating with what they called terrorists who had murdered thousands of council personnel. Lyria had listened to their complaints with growing frustration and finally reminded them that the council had sent warships first and that humanity had every right to defend their home against invasion. Ambassador Vrel, a tall reptilian from the Korath Empire, had sneered at her and said that primitives who violated quarantine deserved whatever punishment they received, and Lyria had nearly let Ember respond to the insult before calming the angry dragon. Through their bond now, as they crossed into the territory that had been forbidden for 3 centuries, Lyria felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her, and if these negotiations failed, the galaxy might face a war unlike anything it had seen before. Kira reported that they were being scanned by multiple sources, and human ships were tracking their movement, but had not moved to intercept. Lyria sent a transmission on the frequency Captain Hayes had provided requesting permission to approach Earth for diplomatic talks, and she waited nervously for a response while the diplomats behind her whispered among themselves. The reply came within minutes, and Captain Hayes appeared on the view screen, looking exactly as she had during their first encounter, and she welcomed the diplomatic convoy and provided coordinates for a meeting station that humans had constructed at the edge of their system. The station was called Gateway, and it had not existed 2 months ago, but humans had built it specifically for these negotiations, and it was massive with docking facilities for dozens of ships and meeting rooms and living quarters for hundreds of beings. As Lyria's convoy approached, she could see human defense platforms surrounding the station and several of the black warships patrolling nearby, and the message was clear that humans were willing to talk, but were prepared to fight if necessary. The docking procedure went smoothly, and soon, Lyria found herself walking through Gateway's corridors with Ash and Ember beside her, and the diplomatic team following behind. The station was clean and modern with technology that matched or exceeded anything the council used, and Lyria noticed that human guards stood at regular intervals wearing armor and carrying weapons that looked deceptively simple, but probably contained innovations the galaxy had never seen. They were led to a large conference room with a round table that could seat 30 people, and windows that looked out at the stars, and Earth hung in the distance like a blue and white jewel captain. Hayes was already there, along with a dozen other humans who represented their government and military and scientific communities. And Linda smiled when she saw Lyria and greeted her warmly. The human captain introduced the other members of her delegation, and Lyria noticed that they came from different backgrounds and cultures and spoke with different accents, and humanity was clearly not unified in the way council species often were. Ambassador Vrel stepped forward and demanded to know by what authority humans had destroyed council property and murdered council personnel, and his tone was aggressive and confrontational. Captain Hayes's smile disappeared, and she said calmly that humanity had defended itself against an unprovoked attack, and that the council fleet had entered human space with weapons armed and had refused to negotiate. Vrel hissed that humans had no right to leave their quarantine zone, and that breaking council law justified any response. A human man named Jacob Chen, who was introduced as the civilian leader, stood and said that humanity had never agreed to any quarantine, and that being imprisoned for 300 years without trial or representation was a crime against every principle the council claimed to uphold. The two sides argued back and forth for over an hour with accusations and counter-accusations flying across the table, and Lyria could feel the negotiations falling apart before they had truly begun. Finally she stood and both dragons rose with her, and their sudden movement drew everyone's attention. She spoke directly to Ambassador Vrel and told him that his approach was destructive, and that if he continued they would achieve nothing but more bloodshed. Then she turned to the humans and said that while their grievances were valid, they needed to understand that the council was thousands of years old and did not change easily. Proposed that they start with small steps and with building trust rather than trying to solve everything at once. Captain Hayes nodded slowly and asked what Lyria suggested. Lyria said that humanity should be allowed to send ambassadors to council worlds and to establish trade relationships with willing species, and that in return humans should share some of their scientific advances with the council. Several council diplomats objected, saying that giving humans access to the galaxy was too dangerous. But Lyria cut them off and asked what choice they had, and humans could not be contained by force, and isolation had only made them more dangerous, not less. She said the only path forward was integration and giving humanity a stake in galactic peace rather than making them feel like enemies who had nothing to lose. A human woman named Patricia Liu, who was a scientist, spoke up and said that humanity would be willing to share dark matter research with the council, but only if the quarantine was officially ended and humans were granted full citizenship rights. Vrel started to object again, but Theron's voice came through the communication system, and the old counselor had been observing the negotiations remotely. He said that Lyria was correct, and that the council needed to adapt to new realities, and that he would personally sponsor a vote to end the quarantine and grant humanity provisional membership in the galactic community. The room fell silent as everyone processed this unexpected development. Captain Hayes looked at Lyria, and then at her fellow humans, and then back to the council diplomats. She said that humanity accepted provisional membership and would work to prove they deserved full status, and that they wanted peace but would defend themselves if necessary. Over the next 3 days, the negotiations continued, and slowly, a framework began to emerge. The quarantine would end, and humans would be allowed to establish colonies on uninhabited worlds and trade with other species. In return, humanity would share some of their technological advances and would accept council observers who would report on human activities. It was not perfect, and many on both sides were unhappy with compromises. But it was a beginning, and Lyria felt hope growing in her chest as she watched former enemies working together to find solutions. On the final day, Captain Hayes invited Lyria to visit Earth and to see the world that had been hidden for so long. Lyria accepted and took a shuttle down to the surface with ash and ember, and she stood on human soil and looked up at a blue sky and felt wind on her face. Humans gathered to see the first non-human visitor in 3 centuries, and they were curious and friendly, and showed her cities that mixed nature and technology in beautiful ways. Linda Hayes walked with her through a park where children played and old people sat on benches, and she said that this was what humanity had been fighting for. Not conquest or domination, but simply the right to exist and to grow and to reach for the stars like every other species. Lyria understood then that the council had been wrong, and that humans were not monsters, but people who wanted the same things everyone wanted. She promised Linda that she would work to ensure the peace held, and that one day humans and elves might explore the galaxy together as true friends. As her ship left Earth and began the journey home, Lyria looked back at the blue world and felt that something important had changed. 6 months passed after the historic agreement, and Lyria found herself traveling between council space and human territory more often than she ever imagined possible, and her role had evolved from scout commander to official liaison between humanity and the Galactic Council. The transition had not been smooth, and there were incidents and misunderstandings and moments when it seemed like the fragile peace might shatter. Some council species refused to trade with humans or allow them on their worlds, and human colonists faced discrimination and suspicion wherever they went. But there were also successes and stories that gave Lyria hope for the future. A human medical team had helped stop a plague on a Korath colony world, and their techniques had saved thousands of lives, and even Ambassador Vrel had been forced to acknowledge their contribution. Human engineers had designed new shield systems that used principles from dark matter research, and several council species had purchased the technology and strengthened their defenses. And most importantly, human ambassadors had taken their seats in the council chambers and were participating in debates about galactic policy, and their perspectives often challenged old assumptions in useful ways. Lyria's ship, the vessel she had commanded for years, had been upgraded with human technology, and now moved faster and scanned more efficiently than before, and her crew had grown to include 2 human officers who worked alongside the elves. Ash and Ember had also changed, and the dragons had developed a fascination with human culture, and especially with human food, and Lyria often found them begging treats from the human crew members who spoiled them terribly. She was returning to Gateway Station for a quarterly review meeting when Kira reported unusual activity in a nearby sector, and multiple ships were gathering at coordinates that held no strategic value. Lyria ordered a course change to investigate, and as they approached, she saw something that made her smile. Human ships and council vessels were working together to construct what looked like a research station, and crews from different species moved between ships, sharing expertise and resources. Captain Hayes contacted her and explained that this was a joint project to study dark matter and spatial phenomena, and scientists from 12 species were collaborating on research that might revolutionize space travel. Lyria felt pride swelling in her chest, because this was exactly what she had hoped for when she first advocated for peace in humans and other species working together and achieving things that neither could accomplish alone. She attended the review meeting at Gateway, where representatives discussed progress and problems and planned for the future. There were still challenges, and some council members wanted to restrict human expansion, and some humans grew impatient with the slow pace of change. But Theron reminded everyone that transformation took time, and that 6 months of peace was an achievement worth celebrating after 300 years of isolation. After the meeting, Lyria found Captain Hayes in one of Gateway's observation lounges, looking out at Earth in the distance. Linda smiled when Lyria approached and gestured for her to sit, and Ash and Ember settled on the floor between them. The human captain said she wanted to thank Lyria personally for everything she had done, and that without her courage and advocacy, the peace might never have happened. Lyria shook her head and said that humans had earned their freedom through their own strength and innovation, and she had simply helped both sides see reason. Linda laughed and said that seeing reason was often the hardest part of any conflict, and that having someone willing to stand between 2 angry powers and demand better from both was rare and valuable. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching ships come and go from the station, and Lyria thought about how much had changed since that terrible day when she first saw the debris field. She asked Linda what humanity planned to do with their freedom, now that they had it. The captain considered the question carefully and said that humans wanted to explore and to learn and to find their place in the galaxy. She said they wanted to build rather than destroy, and to prove that the Council's fears had been wrong. But Linda added with a serious expression that humanity would never be caged again and would defend their freedom with everything they had if necessary. Lyria understood and said that was fair, and that any species would do the same. She asked if Linda thought the peace would last. The human was quiet for a long moment before answering, and she said that peace was not something that happened once and then lasted forever. It was something that had to be chosen every day by every person and every government. There would be more challenges and more conflicts and moments when war seemed easier than negotiation. But if enough people on both sides kept choosing peace and kept working to build bridges instead of walls, then maybe it would last. Lyria agreed, and felt the truth of those words settling into her bones. Ash and Ember stirred, and both dragons looked up at their bonded partner with love and trust in their eyes. Through their connection, Lyria felt their confidence that she would continue to do what was right, and would keep fighting for peace, no matter how difficult it became. She made a silent promise to them and to herself that she would not fail. Later that day, Lyria attended a ceremony marking the official opening of the joint research station, and humans and council members gathered to celebrate. Their cooperation speeches were made and hands were shaken, and Lyria stood back and watched with satisfaction. A young human scientist approached her nervously and asked if she could pet the dragons, and Lyria smiled and said, yes. Ash and Ember allowed the woman to stroke their scales and rumbled with pleasure at the attention. And soon a small crowd had gathered, wanting to meet the legendary dragons who had witnessed the first contact. Lyria answered questions and told stories, and realized that she was becoming a symbol of the new era of cooperation. It was a responsibility she had never wanted, but one she accepted willingly. As the party continued into the evening, Lyria stepped outside onto an observation deck and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there were billions of beings living their lives, and most of them would never know how close the galaxy had come to war. They would never know about the destroyed fleet or the dark matter weapons or the tense negotiations that had prevented catastrophe, but they would benefit from the peace and from the cooperation between species and from the new technologies and ideas that emerged when different cultures worked together, and that Lyria thought was enough. She felt Ash press against her leg, and Ember nuzzle her hand, and through their bond came feelings of contentment and pride. They had done something important together and had helped change the course of history. The future was still uncertain, and there would be more challenges ahead. But for now, in this moment, looking up at the stars with her dragons beside her, Lyria felt hope. The age of isolation was over, and the age of cooperation had begun. Humanity had shattered the old order with their dark matter weapons and their refusal to remain caged, but they had also shown that they could be partners and friends and contributors to galactic civilization. The Council had learned that fear and control were not the answer, and that different did not mean dangerous. And Lyria had learned that one person could make a difference if they were willing to stand up for what was right. She smiled and called to her dragons, and together they returned to the party to celebrate the future they had helped create. Tomorrow would bring new problems and new struggles, but tonight they had earned the right to enjoy their victory. The galaxy had changed and would never be the same again, and Lyria was proud to have been part of that change.